Hello and welcome back to the second short video lecture for Module 1, where we ask a pretty straightforward question, which is, what is philosophy? What is it that we're studying? Because this course is about the history of philosophy, and before we go any further, it might be a good idea to try to pin down what it is that we're actually talking about. So that's what I'd like to do here, and it's only about maybe 6 or 8 slides, 10 at the most, I think, I forget, but it's a question that I think is worth asking. Okay, so if we were to crack open a dictionary and try to define the term philosophy and answer the question, what is it? We would find something like this. So philosophy, or philosophies in the plural, would be 1, the rational investigation of being, knowledge, and right conduct. So being is otherwise known as ontology. Knowledge is known as epistemology, and right conduct is known as ethics. So it's the rational investigation of ontology, epistemology, or morality. So that is kind of the prime idea, the prime sort of motivator to philosophize or to do philosophy. The second one, and I had mentioned this before in the previous slide, that there are a whole range of schools of thought. Right, there is continental, Islamic, Eastern, African, Indian. Each of these schools of thought or systems within those schools of thought define one point of view versus another. And generally speaking, in continental philosophy, which is what we're going to be doing, when we talk about a system or a school of thought, we can talk about the philosophy of a specific person. Here would be Descartes, it could be Nietzsche, it could be Hegel, whoever. Or a system would be something like idealism or materialism. Or it could be the difference between rationalism and empiricism. All these different isms, these schools, are all part of what philosophy is. So the first is a rational investigation into something. The second is to either create a school of thought, which does happen periodically, or if not, to adhere to a particular system which is in existence at that particular time, whatever ism it may be, rationalism, empiricism, and so on, and try to move in a new direction, if that's at all possible. So those are the first two. The third one is the critical study of basic principles and concepts of a discipline. You could have the philosophy of law. I teach the philosophy of humor, for example. Now, I have taught philosophy of law as well, but that one I haven't done for several years. But the philosophy of something is basically the collecting together of the basic principles and concepts of a discipline. So the philosophy of something can really be wide-ranging, but it is the critical study of the laws which pertain to either a certain way of doing things or a certain discipline or institution. Political philosophy is one. Then we start moving backwards, right? So the first three are sort of fairly contemporary. The fourth one is a bit more archaic. The investigation of natural phenomena, alchemy, astrology, astronomy. Now, just even this early into the course, you might be reminded of the Pre-Socratics, because I'd mentioned that they were natural philosophers, natural scientists. So they're more the kind of archaic early versions of philosophy. And again, we are applying these terms in hindsight. We're looking back to what the Pre-Socratics had done and identified it as, it was a kind of philosophy. Maybe not the best, the most comprehensive, and it was still in its infancy. But at the very least, it was still the investigation of natural phenomena. And so alchemy, maybe not practiced anymore, turning things into gold, if you can, have at it, right? It's pretty lucrative. But astrology and astronomy are certainly things that we continue to study. 5, any system of belief, values, or tenets. So as it relates to 2 and 3, any system or belief or system of values and tenets collected together will be known as a philosophy. So you can see how philosophy of law, philosophy of anything, really, any system of beliefs that people learn and adhere to is a kind of philosophy. 6, a personal outlook or viewpoint. my philosophy is live and let live. Opposed to my philosophy is I just get into someone's grill and I just let them know what I think. Well, I think I'd want to go for the first one. So any system of belief, personal outlook, and how that informs that personal outlook really will be the way which individuals, interact with the world and especially with each other. So a personal outlook or viewpoint, a philosophy may be something that will change over time. The tendency is individuals, if they are a little bit left of center, as they get older, tend to move sort of right of center. Not all the time. Some people get even more cranky and even more leftist. But it is still a personal outlook that can be defined as a kind of philosophy. Why? Because that personal outlook is informed by a system of beliefs and values. That's how it works. Now, finally, a really old one, again, because we're looking at the more archaic ones, is a serenity or temper. Now, to be temperate is to be calm and even. And to have a philosophical temper is to have a kind of temper that is somewhat even-tempered, objective, disinterested. What you're doing is you're observing without engaging, right? And that can be a good thing, especially if you're trying to learn something. To have a degree of serenity and temper means that you're not being bothered by small incremental details. You're looking at the big picture, right? You're looking for those systems of beliefs, for example. And so those definitions all together create what's known as philosophy. So what is philosophy? Rational investigation, a school or system of thought, the critical study of the principles of a discipline, or the investigation of natural phenomena, a system of beliefs, a personal outlook, or finally, a sense of temperance, right? Even-handedness. And really, if you were to break down the word from Latin philosophia or the Greek philosophos, lover of wisdom, that's what philosophy is. Philosophy is basically, Sophie is wisdom, philo, love. So love of wisdom. That's essentially what it is. The love of knowledge. I mean, we wish to attain wisdom, but the only way to attain wisdom is to gather together knowledge. So it is a lover of wisdom. It's a lover of being at that point in your life where you can be wise because you've learned things through a personal outlook, through engaging in a system of beliefs, by entering to and adhering to a school of thought and so on. And so if you use a degree of temperance, objectivity, disconnectedness and being dispassionate and rationally investigate something, what you're doing more or less is a kind of philosophy. So what we need to remember is what William of Oakum, writing literally in the 1300s, it's known as Oakum's razor. And Oakum's razor, in a sense, slices apart the known world from the unknown world, or the physical world from the metaphysical world, because both coexist in philosophy. But what Oakum does, using his razor, is he makes the following statement, which is pretty profound for the 1300s, because guess what? It's still relevant. And he says, one should not account for the existence of an empirically given thing by imagining, notice the word imagining, right? Conjuring up, by imagining behind and beyond it another thing whose hypothetical existence cannot be verified. So we talked in the first video lecture about metaphysics over time beginning to crumble. William of Oakum fires the first shot, right? He fires one right across the bow of the ship called metaphysics by saying, no, you can't account for a given thing by imagining something else behind it that you can't even prove that existence. So you can't work backwards to front. No, we need to be able to understand what we see in front of us with our senses. So our senses need to be able to make sense of what's going on. So Oakum's razor slices apart this relationship that we have between that empirically given thing and the imagination or the imagining or conjuring up of this hypothetical set of laws that are, of course, predictable, but whose hypothetical existence can't be verified. So as early as the 1300s, we were already being warned. Now, much later, Etienne Gilson, who wrote this book right here, The Unity of Philosophical Experience, an excellent, fascinating book, he says, within the first few pages, man, of course, as he describes it, human beings are metaphysical animals. We have a tendency to go above and beyond what we see, to try to understand what is going on behind. So Etienne Gilson, much like Oakum, is kind of reminding us that we are metaphysical animals. Because we can think and because we can conjure up and imagine things, we tend to fall into or slip into that philosophical mode quite easily. And so there is the problem within us to try to explain something with using something else. And that something else is often something that lies behind it that can't be measured as easily. Because using our senses, we can talk about the color or shape or texture or weight of something. Those are givens. Anything after that is conjuring. So he writes, recognizing there is a basic tendencies in humans to seek the truth and experience of reality, Gilson underlines the principle that we are metaphysical animals. We use our reason to go beyond particular sciences, seeking a transcendent explanation of our world. From the get-go, the Pre-Socratics hit the ground running, doing exactly that. As they tried to understand the world around them, the cosmos, astronomy, astrology, and all these kinds of things, the first thing they did was, unaware, of course, that they were metaphysical animals, as we are today, they were using their limited reason to already go beyond particular sciences. Now, during the time of the Pre-Socratics, the sciences are, again, in their infancy. They're just starting out. So historically, we're on the ground floor. But lo and behold, here we are already as metaphysical animals. We're using our reason to go beyond particular sciences, seeking a kind of otherworldly or transcendent, right, to rise above something, to look for an explanation of the world beyond that world. In presenting what he judges to be the sound approach to reality, Gilson emphasizes that our knowledge begins with the intuition of being, the knowledge and awareness of being, who we are, where we are, how we see the world. We begin our intellectual life not by reflecting on knowledge, which is what Plato had asked us to do, but by the sensio-intellectual experience of things, the tangible, methodical understanding of reality, and trying as hard as possible not to build that bridge into the other world. So a good philosopher is not only aware of that tendency to be a metaphysical animal, but tries as hard as possible to fully experience the thing in front of them, right? The sensio-intellectual experience of things. So Gilson believes that that is true philosophy. So he talks about the thingness. Now, in this book, in French, it's chosité, right? Doesn't matter. Thingness is probably the best way to describe it. So the thingness, the actualness of a thing, is the foundation and principle of our thinking, is that something actually exists, that there is something existing in front of us, that we're not disbelieving reality, because when we get to Descartes, it gets pretty weird. And then we have Berkeley shortly after, George Berkeley, who says, no, reality doesn't exist. But we have categories in our minds to make sense of it. And when pressed even further, you say, look, Mr. Berkeley or Bishop Berkeley, reality doesn't exist. Well, it does because God sees it. Okay, now guess what? You just tried to explain something with a metaphysical entity that I can't prove the existence of. We're back to the same problem. So, Etienne Gilson talks about the intuition of being in all of its authentic, sensual nature, right? Open to experience. So this is something I'd like you to keep in mind as we kind of move through all this material, the degree to which we sometimes lose sight of the thingness of the world. We get it back, right? We get it back by the 20th century, and early thinkers such as Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche point us in the right direction, right? So that we finally rediscover maybe, or perhaps discover for the first time, what it is to do philosophy. So in this book here, Unity of Philosophical Experience, Etienne kind of breaks down the notion of the philosophical experience into these four laws. The first one is philosophy always buries its undertakers. Now, what does he mean by that? What he means is that the philosopher who is the skeptic, right? William of Oakum, I am skeptical that you can explain to me the here and now with something that doesn't exist in front of me. So the skeptical of a previous philosophy must destroy that philosophy before creating their own. So philosophy always buries its undertakers. It takes everyone down with it. So the skeptic needs to destroy philosophy before they can create their own. And as we move through these different fields, these different eras, and for example, in this book, we have the medieval experiment, then the Cartesian experiment, and then finally the modern experiment. And then finally, the very last one where Gilson makes his main claims, the nature and unity of philosophical experience, as I'm describing it here. So the first law is that philosophy always buries its undertakers. The second one is by our very nature, we are metaphysical animals, as I mentioned. Since we are essentially rational, right, we have reason and rationality, the constant recurrence of metaphysics in the history of knowledge must have its explanation in the very structure of reason. In other words, built into reason is this capacity or tendency to make that metaphysical jump. So the way that reason is structured, we have a history, a tendency, but certainly a history to do exactly that. Somehow, reason is designed to do this very easily. That we begin to see the world, we ration it out, we reason it out, we're making computations, which is the older Latin version of reason. We start making these computations, and we realize that the recurrence of metaphysics, right, the return of metaphysics over and over again seems to have its explanation in the fact that reason kind of wants to have metaphysics continue to exist. So that's kind of where the second law sits. The third is metaphysics as knowledge gathered by a naturally transcendent reason, ours, because we are metaphysical creatures, in search of first principles of what is given in sensible experience. So as we try to build that bridge from the physical world to the metaphysical world, so as we transcend, so as we move from one to the other, using this kind of reason, this bridge built of reason and rationality, the first thing we do when we experience something is we start looking for these first principles. Now, when we look at the Pre-Socratics, and if you're watching this first set of videos, and you're watching this one second, again, think back to the Pre-Socratics, that arche, right? That foundational principle, right? The first principles that Gilson is talking about here. Same kind of thing is happening, right? We have the tendency, because we are equipped with reason, to constantly transcend that experience, right? The thingness that we experience, rather than stop there and fully experience the phenomena, right? Phenomenology is a kind of philosophy. And that's exactly what it does. It opens us to the full experience of the thing in front of us rather than trying to transcend. Excuse me. So transcendence is the name given to human reason's capacity to overstep all sensible experience. It is the permanent source of our metaphysical illusions. Our capacity to transcend from the physical to the metaphysical world using reason as we philosophize about the world. And rather than stop at the thingness, we're constantly trying to push beyond it, right? Transcend beyond it. What we are doing is what is called transcendence. It's a name given to our capacity, our tendency to move and overstep that sensible experience, which is empiricism. Materialism is what is also known. But the end result is we end up with what William of Oakum is warning us about, those imaginary illusions. So those metaphysical illusions are basically agreed upon. Because what I want you to understand is, before we even start and move into module 1, 2, 3, and so on, is these are all opinions, very highfalutin and very well reasoned opinions. But they are, right? And they border on metaphysical illusions. So let's always remember that. This is the product of a single person thinking, which that single person creates a school of thought. And that school of thought is bought into for a period of time. And then along comes a skeptic, says, Cartesian thinking may not be the best. Hegelian thinking, I think, has got some problems. And sure enough, they push, and that skeptical and the doubting nature, right, which is the opposite of transcending, right? When you're skeptical, you're kind of pushing back, not entering into something. And then eventually that philosophy falls apart. So the permanent source of metaphysical illusions is not only transcendence, but the ability to transcend out of our lived experience using reason. So what does that leave us with? It leaves us with the fourth law. As metaphysics aims at transcending all knowledge, physical, material, empirical knowledge, no science is competent either to solve metaphysical problems, because we're not in the real world anymore, right? We're in that metaphysical world that is either an illusion or can be proven. So no science is competent either to solve metaphysical problems. The only science would be perhaps philosophy, but philosophy created the problem in the first place, or to judge the metaphysical solutions. Metaphysics is bound to fail when it substitutes the fundamental concepts of any other science for those of metaphysics. So what Gilson is alluding to here is we can't use other forms of science other than philosophy to try to either shore up metaphysics or the opposite, to break it apart. Because the sciences that we know of deal with the empirical world. They deal with the thingness of the world. That's what science does. It tends to be reasonable, rational, empirical. There's no such thing as a metaphysical science. And the only thing that is philosophy. So that is the only science, if you wish to call philosophy a science, it is the only science that can address some of the issues that are inherent in metaphysics, because all others simply cannot grasp the object in order to study it. That's essentially what Gilson is saying. Now, we were talking about metaphysical illusions, and one of the really interesting characters that identifies the notion of metaphysical illusions is Hans Wanninger. And Hans Wanninger wrote this book, The Philosophy of the As-If. The title says it all, literally says it all. So I'll read this passage and we'll break it down. Wanninger says, I call this work The Philosophy of As-If because it seemed to me to express more convincingly than any other possible title that I wanted to say, namely that as if, in other words, appearance, the consciously false, plays an enormous part in science, in world philosophies, and in life. He's not saying that we're lying to ourselves, but we are awfully capable, almost to a fault, we are capable of creating worlds that help to explain the worlds that we live in. So natural laws or predictable laws, that to Wanninger is really the as if. It's as if things were like so. And we need to remember that that is exactly what it is. It's an illusion. It's consciously false, but it helps us. It helps us to understand the world. So he goes on. I wanted to give a complete enumeration of all the methods in which we operate intentionally. So we operate intentionally with consciously false ideas, or rather judgments. So we know what we're doing. We know what we're doing. We try to forget that we're making these things up. Plato went out of his way to create idealism. I mean, literally out of his own head. So he's still a human being. He's still a person. He's not a robot. He's not an AI. He's not a computer. He's not a book. He's a person. And Plato was trying to respond to a particular historical problem that we'll look at. But he forgot to tell us that his explanation of the world was still working within false ideas and judgments. We bought into it and it made sense and we agreed to it. But over time, as we develop in our history of consciousness, we eventually realized, now notice when this was written, the philosophy is as if was written in 1925. So about 100 years ago, someone had to finally come out and remind us, hey, don't forget, you're making this up. William of Oakum may have told you, I'm going to split this world in half between the physical and the metaphysical and remind you that those two worlds do not coexist except through reason. So they're all consciously false ideas. So for the method of fiction, which is found in a greater or lesser degree in all the sciences, can best be expressed by this complex conjunction as if. So are we conducting or engaging in philosophy falsely or unethically? No, not really. What we are forgetting, though, or what we are doing, is forgetting that we are constructing all of these metaphysical entities, these predictable models, right? That's what Venegar is getting at. So he's not trying to discover something. He's trying to remind us that when we are doing philosophy, right? What is philosophy? It is a school of thought, a system of ideas, beliefs, and so on. Beliefs. Think about that. I believe something. Is that true knowledge? It borders on knowledge, providing you can find, grounds upon which you can rest that. Venegar is simply reminding us that the as if, right, the appearance, the consciously false, plays a large part in philosophies, right? The construction of unverifiable, maybe not untenable, because they are tenable. They can be for hundreds of years. But these are consciously false structures that we build around something, around that thingness, right, that we're trying to study in order to make sense of it. It's, if you were to imagine a metaphor, imagine the sculptor buying a large block of granite, so big that they need to build a structure, like a scaffold around it. The scaffold is required in order to create the sculpture. Once a sculpture is finished, the scaffold is removed. What we forget to do when we're doing philosophy is to remove the scaffold. We forget to do that. And Venegar is simply there to remind us. Now we move into the 20th century. Theodor Adorno, another very famous philosopher from the continental tradition, wrote a book in 1966 called Negative Dialectics. There it is right there. And notice the date again, 1966, roughly 20 years after the end of the Second World War. And this is, of course, carnage beyond carnage. And of course, where he was living, Adorno being German, Germany and Western Europe experienced not one but two world wars. So there was a real problem with engaging and believing in reason and rationality, because the values associated with reason and rationality and science led to destruction, led to the atomic bomb. And so Adorno asks a simple question, right? And thinks about the possibility of philosophy and writes in Negative Dialectics, philosophy, which once seemed obsolete, lives on because the moment to realize it was missed. So the fact that philosophy has always been around, we now need to maybe step back and ask ourselves, what was philosophy supposed to do in the first place? If thinking reasonably and rationally, and with a value system and a belief system, if that belief system leads only to war and destruction, well, we maybe have missed the moment of what it really meant, right? What it really, truly meant was to think about the world, right? To think and reflect upon the world that we're in, rather than building better and better killing machines. So philosophy, which once seemed obsolete, right, because it was only hell-bent on destruction, actually does continue to live on, because at the moment to realize it was missed. The summary judgments that it had merely interpreted the world, right, that resignation in the face of reality had crippled it, becomes a defeatism of reason after the attempt to change the world miscarried. Now, the second half is a pretty clear echo of what Marx had asked us to do in the 1840s, that prior to his thinking and rethinking of philosophy, philosophers had simply interpreted the world. The time now was to change it, right? Change it for the better. So that's what Adorno is hinting at in that echo. The summary judgment that it had merely interpreted the world, which is what Marx had said, now in the face of reality was stunned. The carnage that was World War I and World War II had literally crippled the capacity of philosophy to engage in something that might make the world better, because the fear was that using reason once again might cause us to do the same damn thing. Can we possibly build something more deadly than an atomic bomb? Can we turn around and create something more pervasive than capitalism? This kind of thing. So the possibility of philosophy is still there, but the fear, as he says, the resignation and the fear of reality that crippled it, the carnage of the Second World War, becomes a kind of defeat of reason, because we, in a sense, misused reason. Rather than aim high and make the world better, we simply made the world more efficient, more rational. And as we made the world more rational, we ended up making it more deadly and dangerous. Okay, so as you can see, when we think about what is philosophy, as we get into the 20th century, there is a lot of disagreement, to say the least. Okay, the next book here, this is Disseminations, Jacques Derrida, mostly a literary theorist, writes extensively about language and about texts and so on. And so he, in his writings, as he took apart Western metaphysics and tried to understand what shores it up, what holds it up, realized, okay, there's something really odd at the very center of philosophy. And what he called it at the center of philosophy was an aporia, which is a kind of impasse. And he says the following, and of course, as a paraphrase, if intuition, now what is intuition? That is the power of obtaining knowledge that cannot be acquired either by inference or observation, by reason or experience. If intuition is knowledge already there and waiting to be discovered. Now, this statement may not make a whole lot of sense to you right now, but if you go back and read these after this course, they will make a lot more sense. So let's unpack this just carefully again. If intuition, now intuition is obtaining knowledge that is not acquired through inference or observation. We're back to ignoring the thingness of the world, right? Because we're not basing it on inference and observation, empirical or materialist observation, reason or experience, the things that make us who we are, right? That sensio intellectual experience that we have of the world. So intuition, which is the capacity to learn about things maybe that are not in the world. So metaphysical things, knowledge that is already there and waiting to be discovered. That's a not a slight, but it's an echo of Plato. Plato believed that all the wisdom of the world was already inside us, and it was a matter of learning to find it, right? Waiting to be discovered within us. So that all the knowledge of the world was already there. It was up to us to become wiser and wiser people and find it. So then what is known as ideal truth is actually not grounded in lived experience. Hopefully you're starting to see a little bit of a pattern here. The moment we step out of our landscape, right, that landscape of reality, the physical world, we kind of get into trouble, don't we? So, intuition, which is the ability to obtain knowledge that doesn't have to be grounded or acquired through observation, in other words, our senses or experience, especially our lived experience. So if intuition is knowledge that's always already there, waiting to be discovered, what we used to call ideal truth is actually something that is not grounded in the thingness of the world. What basis in our consciousness, which is the ground of our knowledge, so what basis in our consciousness do we have for accepting its truth? If it cannot be based on reality or experience or observation, then we can make up any number of things. And if we are in a position of power or we have a school of thought, we can essentially say almost anything and try to pass it off as truth. And really the 20th century in particular is at least in my mind, especially important in terms of voices that had not been heard from before. Disenfranchised voices, silenced voices, disempowered voices. Those voices are now speaking back to us and are saying, look, there's no such thing as an ideal truth. Capital T truth, at the very most, should be lowercase truth, and maybe even in quotations, right? Kind of conditional, kind of situational, but anything that's not grounded in lived experience, be careful. Remember William of Oakum, right? That razor, whoosh, cutting the physical from the metaphysical. So we need to be really careful that intuition, which is knowledge that's just waiting for us to find, guess what? We don't find it in the living real world, that authentic world, but somewhere else. But we've already been warned, right? Those are philosophical illusions or metaphysical illusions. So there's the first part. If that is so, then philosophy is not philosophy as such. It is rather a questioning of philosophy. It is an interrogation of its very possibility. So think back to Adorno, what he had said just prior, right? Philosophy had missed its moment, but it lives on because of that very reason. So what Derrida is telling us is that philosophy today is simply a questioning of the possibility of even doing it. Always being fearful of those bridges that we keep building between the physical and the metaphysical, and how easily we can transcend the world that we're in and essentially lie to us. So the fact that ideal truth is not empirically grounded questions the possibility of philosophy itself and the ground of all knowledge. So knowledge is conditional, it's situational, it's contested and fought over constantly. And this is kind of the world that we should recognize. This is the world we're in right now, where different schools of thought, different beliefs are contesting back and forth, trying to present to the other a more viable understanding of the world. So here is a warning, right? That aporia, that impasse, that deadlock within the very center of philosophy. And the center of philosophy is Platonic thinking. Right, this notion that intuition is knowledge that's always already there, waiting to be discovered, and we're not going to make mistakes, and our subjectivity, right, our personhood, our lived experience, somehow will grasp it as ideal truth. And guess what? Someone that looks different than me, that lives in another part of the world, is going to achieve the same ideal truth? No, they won't. Their lived experience will be a different one. So the notion of an ideal anything should always be in quotations. I'm not saying don't philosophize. Please do. It's the whole point of this course. But right now, with all of these warnings, we should at least think that philosophy is not philosophy as such. It's rather the questioning of philosophy, the capacity, the ability of philosophy to interrogate its very existence. Now, it still creates new ideas. It moves much more slowly, maybe not as confident about itself as it used to be. But the fact that if we can all agree that ideal truth is not empirically grounded in the thingness of the world, as Gilson would say, if it's not empirically grounded, it questions the possibility of philosophy itself and the ground of all knowledge. We need to know that a lot of it is delusional. It is what we think the world is. So finally, a few other folks I want to look at. Gilles Deleuze and Felix Gatari, who were really interesting philosophers. Certainly, well, they were, when they first started, kind of on the fringes, but they have presented to us many, many remarkable ideas that really took a long time for people to understand. And in this particular book, 1,000 Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari, they write, and they present to us a new form of thinking, a new way of thinking out of these impasses, right? Out of this aporia that the Derrida presented to us. And they write it this way. Let us summarize the principal characteristics of a rhizome. And a rhizome, unlike trees or their roots, so imagine a tree and the roots kind of going down into the ground, the rhizome can connect at any point to any other point. So it can move literally in any kind of direction. This rhizome can move in any direction. And its traits are not necessarily linked to traits of the same nature. It brings into play very different regimes of signs or even non-sign states. So a rhizome is this position that we take. And rather than worrying so much about a school of thought being a kind of dogmatic, orthodox viewpoint of the world that is stringent and strident, and it's this way and no other way, the rhizome can start from any point, move in any direction, and can look at different things from different positions. This is what later became known as interdisciplinary thinking. And what that is what I did in my graduate school years, which is to look at, for example, model theory, where I would look for a model, a way of understanding the world in one field, let's say psychoanalysis, and then I find something comparative in literary theory. And now that's not just a hypothesis. I did actually that. I took the model of hysterical conversion from psychoanalysis and applied it to the model of the carnival, which is a literary theory model, and tried to look at the, compare and contrast kind of thing. So the rhizome allows us to connect things together, not arbitrarily. I mean, they need to have some reason to coexist. But what happens now is the rhizome allows us to break out of this sort of as if metaphysical illusion. It can move from one point to another. It can link different things together. And so unlike a structure which is defined by a set of points and positions with binary relationships, up, down, yes, no, black, white, it moves differently. It moves between the positions, right? The rhizome is only made of lines. Lines of segmentary stratification as its dimensions, lines of flight and deterritorialization as the maximum dimension, after which the multiplicity undergoes metamorphosis, changes in nature. Okay, let's unpack that, because that's pretty dense. So the rhizome is made of simply lines. So I don't know if you can see the cover that well, right there. There we go. So this fixture here, I don't know if you can see with the light, it's just a series of lines. But they're lines that intersect, that complement one another, support one another. And so those lines, as they move together, create positions. And they can stratify, they can segment, they create different dimensions and pockets of resistance in one place and pockets of acknowledgement and togetherness in another. It breaks things apart, sort of the territorialization, right? It breaks that apart. And so there is constant metamorphosis, constant change that is going on. It sounds very busy, and it can be a model to understand a new way to think, because finally here at the end, the rhizome is anti-genealogy. So the genealogy of thinking, the genealogy of, say, morality, is the history of morality as it changes from the ancient Greeks through the Dark Ages, the medieval thinkers, then into the 16th century. It's anti-genealogy. It's of the moment, right? It's into the thingness, right? The thingness that is directly in front of it. It can be short-term memory, anti-memory. And so It is constantly moving and reshaping and redefining and repositioning itself, and it's never pinned down. The rhizome is never pinned down. It operates by variations. It expands, it contracts, it conquests, it gives up, it captures, it lets go, it offshoots into different things. The rhizome is one of these really radically new models as a way of thinking in a very interdisciplinary, dynamic, modular kind of way. So as much as it sounded like Adorno said that maybe philosophy wasn't possible anymore, it still is. But what we need to look for are these new models, these new ways of thinking about philosophy that allow us to avoid the pitfalls of pure metaphysical thinking or the tendency to transcend all the time, because a rhizome isn't transcending. It's darting back and forth. Imagine a pinball in a pinball game as it bounces around from one little paddle to the other and bounces off something and scores a point. The rhizome kind of works a little bit like that because it moves constantly, and its very being is to create variety, create offshoots, expanding things in one way or another. Now, it is pretty radical, as a model, but it is something that is certainly worth thinking about. Now, in 1991, Deleuze and Gatari wrote this book, What is Philosophy? And notice the red letters, W-H-Y. Why? What is philosophy? Why should we even ask? And they ask a question here quite early in the first chapter. What is the best way to follow the great philosophers, they ask? Is it to repeat what they said, or to do what they did? That is, create concepts for problems that necessarily change. There's that history, right? The movement of history and movement in history. The history of philosophy means that we evaluate not only the historical novelty of the concepts created by a philosopher, idealism, materialism, Cartesianism, all of those, but also the power of their becoming when they pass into one another. Remember what Gilson had said, right? Philosophy buries its undertakers. It buries its dead, but it buries its undertakers too. So what should we do when we are thinking about philosophy? Do we simply repeat what they say and say, well, Plato thought of idealism and Aristotle thought of materialism, and off we go with all kinds of isms? Or do we do what they did? In other words, to think about a situation that is directly in front of us, and clearly what was in front of Plato back in 400 BC, it's clearly and utterly different than what you and I will experience in 2022. So what we should do is do what they did and create concepts for problems, right, that are now considered modern problems that may have a history and a development, but necessarily change. Because we clearly cannot apply a concept formulated in 1712 to a problem in 2022. It just doesn't work. So they say the history of philosophy means that we evaluate not only the historical novelty of the concept, what it was at the time, what it was addressing, what it was trying to accomplish, and of course created by a philosopher, an individual, but also the power of their becoming, right? As the skeptic, right? The skeptic comes up. Remember Gilson's skeptic who has to destroy philosophy to create something new. So the interesting thing about doing philosophy is not only to understand what these individuals did and how they created concepts, but not only that, but how they pass into one another, how they become something else. Finally, the last two here, Giorgio Agamben is still alive, born in 1942. And this is from a book called Language and Death. Nice heavy-duty title. There you go, right here, Language and Death. In this book, Agamben is talking about the confrontation between writing, poetry, and philosophy. And what he says, and I think it's relevant for us because we've talked about these themes already, and what he says is the following. The confrontation, right, this is confronting one with the other. The confrontation between poetry and philosophy is much more than just simply a rivalry. Both seek to grasp that original, inaccessible place of the world, which for us is the highest stake. So are we looking at that arche, that foundational principle, that original inaccessible place of the world, the birth of language, the birth of being, whatever it may be? So, but both poetry and philosophy, faithful in their musical inspiration, finally demonstrate this place as unattainable. We should be aware that that inaccessible place truly is. It's very much like mythology. Mythology should never come into being. It is an aspiration. It is a sign of our highest achievements or highest desires to achieve, and we always fall short. So in the same way that mythology sort of perennially is going to disappoint us, it will always disappoint us because we can't grasp the world in the way it's defined and described to us in mythology. We aim high, we do the best we can, but it's always an inaccessible place. And so philosophy tries to grasp this thing which cannot be grasped. And so if it can do anything, right, the interrogation of philosophy, right, the interrogation of its possibility demonstrates that this place is unattainable. Philosophy, which is born precisely as an attempt to liberate poetry from its inspiration, finally manages to grasp the muse and transform it as spirit into its own subject. And the spirit is precisely the negative, or what Plato called the most beautiful voice that belongs to the muse of the philosophers. According to Plato, a voice without a sound. So what is he talking about here? Here we're describing philosophy being inspired. It liberates itself from poetry. Now, what does that mean? We'll see when we talk about the Pre-Socratics and Plato in particular, that up until that time in the ancient world, mythology was not only a kind of religion, but was also an explanatory model to describe why the world looked the way it did. And so philosophy is born out of this attempt to break away from mythological thinking and move towards scientific thinking. So it liberates itself and finds that liberation very inspiring. And now, because again, with Greece, at the time philosophy begins, and again, we're looking at it in hindsight, philosophy begins when a brand new written Greek alphabet is devised. So it breaks away from poetry, which was basically the content of the content of poetry was mythology. Philosophy breaks from that, finds that very inspiring, and of course, the muse, which of course always informs writers to think and present themselves in the best way forward. This is what he's talking about, the most beautiful voice. But what happens is, for Plato, it's a voice without a sound. It is the ability to speak without actually uttering. And it's splitting hairs. Of course it is. So a voice without a sound is a kind of nothing, right? It's a beautiful voice, but it's a voice that we can't hear because it's not making a sound. So it's transformed as spirit into its own subject. And so the subject that philosophy is going on about is trying to find once again that primordial, inaccessible place of the world or in the world, and ultimately realizing that it cannot be attained because not that it doesn't exist, but we don't have the vocabulary to describe it. That inaccessible place, that pure primordial being, we hint at it. It could be that emptiness within our lives or whatever it is. But when we go to speak, it becomes a voice without a sound. That inaccessible place cannot be accessed because we don't have the words to describe it. As much as philosophy is inspired by breaking away from poetry, both those fields try to keep doing the same thing, trying to define that original place that we believe lives and exists, but we just cannot access it. Now, the last one here is Reiner Sherman, and it's this book here, Tomorrow the Manifold. And he writes in this book, and again, this is all part of the themes that, what is philosophy? I seem to be talking a lot more about what it isn't, but I think making and doing philosophy, all of these issues are important. So Sherman writes in Tomorrow the Manifold, quote, "The progressive collapse of normative reference from Plato and Christianity right through to Kant and positivism. Positivism comes into being in the 19th century, to the free spirits and the discovery of the eternal recurrence, which is a hint or an acknowledgement of Nietzsche, reveals our past to be, quote, the history of an error." Okay, so the progressive collapse of all these normative reference that philosophy and philosophies and schools of thought and systems to understand the world have eventually all fallen apart because it reveals really one thing, the history of an error, that whether we're trying to find an inaccessible place or we're trying to constantly jump into this metaphysical world because we can, because reason is structured to do that, we need to be reminded that it's a history of an error. So the history of philosophy is a history of making the same mistake. So these ultimate representations, which have made the West as fictions of philosophers, remember that as if I mentioned before, right? The fiction of the as if, are fictions of philosophers to be sure, but as punctuations of the will, right? The desire to grasp that inaccessible place no matter what. They are first fictions of the will to power as the indeterminate factors from facere, to make, or fiction of determination. So let's read the last part again. These ultimate representations which have made the West, or fiction, which have made the West, Western philosophy is what he means. These ultimate representations which have made the West are fictions of philosophers. It's the world of the as if, and let's not forget it, to be sure, but as punctuations of the will, of the individual desire to grasp the inaccessible. But they are first fictions of the will to power as the indeterminate factor of determination. So as we are trying to determine and catalog and categorize something, we need to remember that they are fictions. So we need to remind ourselves that the categories that we think are in the world actually are in our own heads. I could have quoted Immanuel Kant as well. I mean, we'll try to work some of Kant's ideas because he too warned us in his critique of pure reason. So these are all ideas that, as much as it is philosophy, there are warnings against philosophy, right? To simply interrogate, and then we end up in a situation like what we looked at here. Philosophy is not philosophy as such. It is rather the questioning of philosophy. Every other person that we see after this, the interrogation of its very possibility. Not to say that it can't be done, but if we know that ideal truth is a fiction, determination is a fiction, all the categories that we apply to reality in the physical world are actually categories all within our own heads. We need to always remember that and never lose sight of that. That's essentially what I'm trying to say. So thank you for sticking with me. Hopefully this has been interesting, maybe a little bit confusing at first. It doesn't matter. This is kind of how I'd like to approach philosophy. Always unpacking it, always breaking it apart like a rhizome, right? Moving in different directions. Whatever we find is interesting, move around and try to make sense of it. Okay, so that is the end of the video lecture for What is Philosophy? And as I just mentioned a moment ago, I probably described as much what it isn't as what it is. We can still do philosophy, but looking at a history of it, we can see how all these issues that we've looked at in this short video, how relevant they all are. So hopefully it was interesting at the very least, and we'll continue on next week when we go into Module 2 and we start looking at why are we even looking at the Greeks in the first place. So I think it's a valid question. All right, take care and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.